The trial was humanity's idea. This was the part that no one had expected. The Concordance Council had been deliberating for 3 months about how to address the situation. 3 months of careful, procedural navigation around the question of whether what humanity had done in the Veth engagement required formal review. And then the human representative had stood up in a regular session and said, "We would like to request a formal tribunal." The chamber had gone very quiet. The human representative was Ambassador Amara, a Semensa, who had been in the position for 4 years and who had a specific quality that people who had worked with her over those 4 years described. In various ways that all meant the same thing. She said what she meant, and she had thought carefully about what she meant before she said it. She said, "The Concordance Council has been deliberating about the Veth engagement for 3 months. We have been watching the deliberation. We understand the concerns." She paused. "We believe the concerns deserve a formal answer rather than a deliberated silence." She paused. "We are requesting a tribunal so that the full record can be presented and reviewed, and so that the Concordance can make an informed decision about what the record means." The Council's chair said, "Ambassador, a formal tribunal would require the human species to present evidence of the engagement in full." She said, "Yes, that is why we are requesting it." The chair said, "The evidence is significant." She said, "Yes, that is also why we are requesting it." She paused. "The Council has been managing the evidence for 3 months. We believe the Council and the human species would both be better served by the evidence being formally reviewed, rather than informally managed." The chair said, "Some members of the Council have expressed concern that formal review would produce outcomes that," she said, "we know what outcomes formal review might produce." She paused. "We are requesting it anyway." She paused. "We have considered the alternative, which is 3 months of deliberation becoming 6 months, becoming a question that is never formally answered and that sits in the Council's record as an unresolved concern." She paused. "We prefer a formal answer, whatever the answer is, to a permanent informal uncertainty." The chair looked at the chamber. The chamber did not object. The tribunal was scheduled. The Veth engagement had lasted 11 days. This was the first number the tribunal's opening statement established. Because the tribunal was going to present numbers, and numbers required context. 11 days. 147 Concordance military personnel, 43 civilian contractors, 19 Veth Dominion vessels. The Korath sector's tertiary approach corridor. The prosecution, if prosecution was the right word, and the Council's legal staff had debated this for 2 weeks before settling on presenting party, as the more accurate term, was led by a Pill legal scholar named Triscal, whose reputation for procedural precision was the reason she had been asked to take the role. She had reviewed the evidence for 6 weeks before the tribunal. She had reviewed it alone, in the archive room that the Council's security division had designated for this purpose, with a sealed access credential that permitted her to view the materials without copying or transmitting them. After 6 weeks, she had requested a meeting with the Council's chair. At the meeting, she had said, "I want you to understand what you're asking me to present." The chair had said, "Present the evidence fairly and completely." She had said, "I will do that." She paused. "I want you to understand that presenting it fairly and completely will produce a specific effect in the chamber." The chair had said, "What effect?" She had said, "I don't have a word for it." She paused. "I'll know it when I see it in the chamber." The chair had said, "You've reviewed the full evidence." She had said, "Yes." The chair had said, "Is it as significant as the preliminary reports indicated?" She had said, "The preliminary reports were accurate about the facts." They were not adequate to convey what the facts mean when you see them in sequence. She paused. She said, "The sequence is the thing." Day 1 of the tribunal covered the engagement's initiation. The Veth Dominion's 19 vessels had entered the Kurith sector's tertiary approach corridor at 600 on the first day. The Concordance's 14th Rapid Response Division, under General Kofi Vasquez Mensa, had been in position. This first day's evidence was not the significant part. It established the situation. It established the force balance, which was 190 Concordance military personnel against the Veth's estimated 800. It established the terrain, which the 14th had been in for days before the Veth arrived. Data covered the first 40 hours. The first 40 hours produced outcome data that Triskal presented in the form of an hour-by-hour tactical record. The record was dry and numerical and was presented on a visual display that showed the positions of both forces in the corridor. At the end of Day 2's presentation, the chamber had the tactical picture of the first 40 hours. The tactical picture was not yet the significant part. Day 3 was when the significant part began. Day 3 covered hours 40 through 72. At hour 40, the Veth Dominion's forces had made a decision. The decision was the thing that the tribunal had been convened to review. The Veth forces had, at hour 40, separated from their vessel complement and had entered the corridor's civilian infrastructure zone. The civilian infrastructure zone was a section of the corridor that contained an unmanned processing installation and 3 habitation modules that had been evacuated before the engagement began. They had entered the civilian zone as a tactical move. The civilian zone offered specific terrain advantages that the corridor's military approaches did not. Moving into the civilian zone changed the engagement geometry in ways that favored the Veth forces' positional situation. It was a sound, tactical decision from a military standpoint. It was also a decision that moved 800 Veth soldiers into an area that the Concordance's rules of engagement designated as a protected zone. General Vasquez Mensa had observed this movement in real time. He had spent for minutes in decision. Then he had issued orders. The orders were what the tribunal was reviewing. Triskal presented the orders in full. The chamber read them. The chamber was quiet for a moment. Then the Horian representative said, "Can you read those again?" Triskal read them again. The orders said, in summary, the Veth force has entered the civilian zone. The civilian zone's protected status is legally triggered by civilian presence, which is currently absent. Tactically, the civilian zone's entry is a choice that produces a specific geometry. We will address the geometry. The orders then specified how. The specification was the part that the chamber had asked to hear again. The specification said, Teams Alpha through Delta will enter the civilian zone through access points 7, 9, 14, and 22 simultaneously. Their objective is not to engage the Veth force directly. Their objective is to be inside the zone with the Veth force, and to make that presence known. Then, Teams Echo and Foxtrot will move 2 positions 3 north and 8 south. Their objective is to be visible from the civilian zone at positions that change the Veth force's geometry without crossing the protected boundary. Then, Teams Golf through Kilo will hold at the corridor approach. Their objective is to be the thing the Veth force is thinking about while Alpha through Delta are doing their work. Then, no team is authorized to initiate engagement unless engaged. The objective of this entire operation is not engagement. The objective is information. Triskal said, "I want to be precise about what the chamber is reading." She paused. General Vasquez Mans divided 1 people into 5 groups. 4 of those groups entered a protected civilian zone alongside 800 Veth soldiers, with orders not to engage. 1 group held the approach. She paused. The objective, as stated in the orders, was information. The Carathri representative said, "What information?" Triscal said, "I'll show you." Dave covered what the orders produced. What the orders produced was 12 hours of footage from the civilian zone, recorded by the personal equipment of the human soldiers in Alpha through Delta as they moved through a space that contained 800 Veth soldiers. Triscal played selected segments. The chamber watched. The first segment was for minutes of Alpha Team moving through Access Point 7 for humans, moving through a corridor that contained approximately 40 Veth soldiers in a defensive configuration. The Veth soldiers were aware of the humans. The humans were aware of the Veth soldiers. Neither side engaged. The chamber watched for humans walk through 40 Veth soldiers. Not past them, through them. The corridor was narrow enough that there was no route that was not through them. The humans walked through. The Veth soldiers did not engage. The chamber was very quiet. The plenary representative said, "Why didn't the Veth engage?" Triscal said, "I'll address that. The next segment." The second segment was 3 minutes. Delta Team, Access Point 22. Similar configuration, a large Veth force, a small human force, a narrow space. This time the Veth force was 44 soldiers. Delta Team was for humans. Delta Team moved through the space. The Veth force watched them. The third segment was longer, 11 minutes of footage from within the Veth force's main concentration, which was in the civilian zone's central hub. The central hub was a large open space, approximately 60 meters across. The Veth force's main element, approximately 300 soldiers, was in the hub. In the hub, distributed among 300 Veth soldiers, were 22 human soldiers from Alpha and Delta teams who had converged on the hub from their respective access points. 22 humans and 300 Veth soldiers in a 60-meter open space for 11 minutes. No engagement. The chamber watched. The PIL representative said, "What are they doing?" Triscal said, "The human soldiers are recording everything they can see." She paused. Positions. Equipment configurations. Farsi distribution communication pattern. She paused. The objective General Vasquez Mensa stated was information. She paused. This is how his soldiers collected it. The Horian representative said, "They walked into 300 soldiers to take notes." Triscal said, "Yes, a pause." She said, "I want to address the question of why the Veth force didn't engage." She pulled up a document. She said, "This is the debrief, report from the Veth force's senior officer, obtained through the post-engagement diplomatic exchange." She paused. "The senior officer's explanation for the non-engagement is significant." She paused. "I am going to read the relevant section." She read. The relevant section said, "The human soldiers who entered our positions were not in a combat posture. They were not in an aggressive posture. They moved through our positions as though our positions were not there." He paused. "We did not engage because engaging required treating them as a threat, and they were not behaving as a threat." He paused. "They were behaving as though they owned the space." He paused. He said, "We have engaged many species. We have never encountered soldiers who moved through our formation as though our formation was irrelevant." He said, "I gave no order to engage because I could not identify what I would be engaging. They were in our positions, but they were not attacking. They were present, but they were not a threat." He paused. "My soldiers looked to me for direction. I had none to give." He paused. "The humans left after approximately 4 hours." He paused. "We were still in our positions." He paused. "But the positions felt different." Triscal set down the document. She said, "The positions felt different." She paused. "I want to return to that phrase." Day 5 covered the tactical outcome. The information collected in the civilian zone by Alpha through Delta was used by General Vasquez Mensa for a specific purpose. The specific purpose was a map. Not a terrain map. The corridor's terrain was already mapped. A map of the Veth forces deployment, where each element was, what it was equipped with, how it was communicating, what its sight lines were, where the gaps were. A complete picture of the Veth forces' position, collected from inside the position by 22 soldiers who had walked through it. The map had been used for what maps were used for, to make decisions about what to do next. The decisions General Vasquez-Mensa made on the basis of the map were the subject of Days 5 and 6 of the Tribunal. Triscal presented them in detail. She presented them in detail because the detail was the thing that made them what they were. The decisions were precise. Each one addressed a specific gap in the Veth forces deployment that the map had revealed. Each one was designed to produce a specific effect at a specific time in a specific location. Each one was built on the assumption that the Veth forces deployment was exactly what the map showed. The map was accurate. The decisions were accurate. The effects were what was designed. The 11-day engagement ended with the Veth Dominion's forces withdrawing from the corridor. The Concordance's force of 190 people had produced the withdrawal of 800. Not by superior firepower, not by superior numbers, by superior information, collected by 22 people walking through a formation of 300, as though the formation wasn't there. The chamber sat with this for a moment. Then the Carathri representative said, "I want to return to something." Triscal said, "Yes," he said, "the civilian zone entry." The human forces entered a protected zone deliberately, along with the Veth force. She said, "Yes," he said, "the zone's protected status was legally inactive because the civilians had evacuated." She said, "That is correct." He said, "So the entry was technically legal?" She said, "The entry was technically legal." "Yes." She paused. The Tribunal's review question is not whether the entry was legal. The review question is what the entry represents about human military doctrine. He said, "What does it represent?" She paused for a longer moment than her previous pauses. She said, "That is what I am going to address on Day 7. Day 7 was the last day. Day 7 had no footage, no tactical maps, no debrief reports. Day 7 was Triscal speaking. She had spent 6 weeks reviewing the evidence. She had spent 3 days presenting it. On Day 7, she was going to say what 6 weeks had produced in someone who had spent those weeks looking at what the evidence meant. She stood at the presentation position. She said, "I want to start with a question." She paused. When a human soldier walks through a formation of Veth soldiers, what is the Veth force experiencing? The chamber waited. She said, "The Veth senior officer's report said, the positions felt different." He paused. "I have been thinking about that phrase for 6 weeks." She paused. "I think I understand what he meant." She said, "The Veth force entered the civilian zone as a tactical move. They moved into a protected area because the terrain was favorable. They organized their positions. They were 800 soldiers in a defined space with a clear perimeter. They were, by any military assessment, secure." She paused. She said, and then 22 humans walked into their positions as though the positions weren't there. She paused. She said, "What the Veth force experienced was not a military threat. If it had been a military threat, they would have known how to respond. They would have engaged or withdrawn or escalated. They had doctrine for military threats." She paused. She said, "What they experienced was something that their doctrine did not have a response for." She paused. 22 beings in their space, among them, making notes. Looking at them, seeing everything, treating their organized defensive formation as though it was a public corridor. She paused. She said, "The positions felt different because the positions had become something different." She paused. They had been a secure enclosure. They had become a space that other beings could enter and move through and observe and leave. She paused. not a fortress, a fishbowl. She said, the human soldiers did not attack the Veth formation. They did something that the Veth formation's doctrine had no response for. They treated the formation as though it was not a barrier. She was quiet for a moment. She said, I have reviewed 11 species military doctrine archives in preparation for this tribunal. She paused. All 11 species doctrines address the same basic military problems: how to project force, how to defend against force, how to deny terrain, how to take terrain. She paused. All 11 doctrines assume a fundamental premise, that an organized military formation is a boundary. It defines who is inside it and who is outside it. It is a line. She paused. She said, human military doctrine does not appear to share this premise. The chamber was very still. She said, in my review of the evidence, I found documentation of 47 similar incidents over the past 12 years in which human forces operated. Inside opposing formations, entered them, moved through them, observed them use the information gathered, withdrew. She paused. 47 incidents. She paused. In 39 of the 47, the opposing force did not engage the human forces inside their formation. She paused. In the 8 cases where engagement did occur, it was initiated by the opposing force's junior officers without command authorization. And in 6 of the 8 cases, the command officer subsequently de-escalated. She said, 39 out of 47 opposing forces encountered humans inside their formation and did not engage them. She paused. She said, I spent 2 weeks trying to understand why. She paused. She said, I think the Veth senior officer's report contains the answer. He said, I could not identify what I would be engaging. They were present, but they were not a threat. He paused. His soldiers looked to him for direction. He had none to give. She said, the opposing forces did not engage because the human forces had created a situation that the opposing forces' doctrine did not have a category for. She paused. Not attack. Not a surrender. Not a withdrawal. Not a negotiation. Something that was none of those things. She said, a presence that was not a threat and was not passive. She paused. A presence that was active and purposeful and entirely outside the binary of threat and non-threat that military doctrine operates within. She said, in 39 out of 47 cases, opposing military forces encountered this presence and froze, not from fear, from a failure of category. They did not know what they were looking at, and they did not know what to do with what they were looking at. She said, that is not a tactical result. That is a cognitive result. She paused. She said, the Veth senior officer said, the positions felt different. She paused. She said, what he was describing was the experience of having his understanding of the world changed from inside a protected formation by 22 people who treated the formation as though it was not a protection. She said, the positions felt different because they had been revealed as something other than what he had understood them to be. He had understood them as a boundary. The humans had demonstrated they were not. She said, that is what the evidence shows. She paused. Not a more powerful weapon. Not a superior tactical doctrine in the conventional sense. She paused. A different fundamental premise about what a military formation is and whether it is a boundary. She said, I do not have a word for what human soldiers did in those 47 incidents. I have spent 6 weeks looking for a word, and I do not have one. She paused. The closest I can come is. They moved through the world as though the things that other species build to separate themselves from each other were not there. She paused. She said, I want to say something that is not in my formal presentation materials. The chair said, go ahead. She said, when I was asked to take this role, I asked to review the evidence before accepting. She paused. I reviewed it and I accepted because I thought the evidence needed to be presented to this chamber, and I thought I could present it fairly. She paused. I have tried to do that over the past 7 days. She said, I want to say that after 6 weeks with this evidence, I have a specific concern. The concern is not about what humans did in the 47 incidents. What they did in those incidents was, each time, legal by the applicable framework. What they did was tactically effective. What they did protected Concordance interests and personnel. She paused. She said, my concern is about what the 47 incidents reveal, about what humans are. She said, every species that joins the Concordance brings a history of how they survived in the environment that shaped them, a history of the problems they solved and the tools they developed to solve them. She paused. The military doctrine of each species reflects that history. It reflects what that species learned about how to navigate a world that contained other beings who could be a threat. She said, human military doctrine reflects a history of 4,000 years of solving the problem, of how to move through a world that contained things that could kill you. She paused. The solution they developed is not the solution that any other species in this chamber developed. She paused. The solution is, move through the world anyway. Move through the things that are supposed to stop you. Treat the boundaries as permeable. Treat the barriers as suggestions. She said, in the Veth engagement, 22 humans walked through 300 soldiers because they had decided the 300 soldiers were not a barrier. She paused. She said, the question for this tribunal is whether that decision and the 46 other decisions like it represent a military capability that the Concordance's existing framework can accommodate. She paused. She said, I have a preliminary answer to that question, which I want to share before the chamber deliberates. The chamber waited. She said, the existing framework was not designed to accommodate it. She paused. The existing framework assumes that military formations are boundaries. She said, the tribunal was requested by the human species. They requested it because they wanted a formal answer. She paused. I have tried to give the chamber what it needs to produce a formal answer. She paused. Whatever the answer is, and that is for the chamber, not me, it should be based on the full record. She paused. She said, the full record is what you have seen over these 7 days. She stepped back from the presentation position. That protected zones are protections. That an organized, defensive position deters penetration. She paused. Human military practice does not share these assumptions. She paused. The framework and the practice are not compatible. She said, I want to be precise about what I am saying. I am not saying that what humans did was wrong. I am saying that the framework cannot hold both what humans do and what the framework assumes beings do. One of them needs to change. The chamber was extremely quiet. She said, the full record is what I found when I spent 6 weeks, looking at what humanity has been doing for 4,000 years. She paused one final time. She said, it is not what I expected to find. The tribunal deliberated for 9 days. On the 10th day, the council issued its finding. The finding said, the tribunal has reviewed the full record of the Veth engagement and 46 related incidents. The tribunal finds no violation of the Concordance's existing framework in any of the 47 incidents reviewed. The finding then said, the tribunal also finds that the existing framework contains provisions that were designed around assumptions about military conduct that the human species practice does not consistently share. The tribunal recommends a comprehensive review of those provisions with the specific goal of determining whether the assumptions they rest on are universal or species-specific. The finding then said, the tribunal commends the human species representative for requesting this formal review rather than allowing the matter to. remain in informal deliberation. The tribunal notes that the decision to request a tribunal reflected an understanding that formal answers are preferable to permanent uncertainty, and that this understanding itself reflects the kind of engagement with concordance institutions that the Council values in its members. Ambassador Asamensa received the finding in her office. She read it 3 times. Then she sent one message to the Unified Defense Council. The message said, "Finding received. No violation. Framework review recommended." She paused. "I'll explain the last part when I'm home." She looked out the window of the council building at the specific sky of the station's artificial daylight. She thought about what Triskal had said on day 7. She thought about the phrase, "Move through the world anyway." She thought about 4,000 years. She thought, we didn't develop this because we wanted to be frightening. She thought, we developed this because the world we came from did not slow down for us, and we could not slow down for it. She thought, we moved through the things that were supposed to stop us because the things that were supposed to stop us were everywhere, and we had to go somewhere. She thought, the Concordance is learning this about us. She thought, we have been learning it about ourselves for 4,000 years, and we are still learning it. She looked at the finding one more time. No violation. Framework review recommended. She thought, that is the right answer. She thought, the framework should be able to hold what we are. She thought, we are worth holding.